Welcome to the first of a series of presentations by this year's honors cohort. My name is Rod Ewing. I'm a member of the teaching team, which includes Professor Amy Ziegart and Dr. Asfandyar Mir. It goes without saying how pleased we are to be able to present these students to you. And so let's get on with it. The first student to make the presentation is Nathalie Kiersznowski. Nathalie's a senior from Kansas City, Kansas, studying economics and political science. Her experiences working for the World Bank and studying at Oxford have made her passionate about the intersection of economic development, human rights, and violence prevention. After graduation, she plans on conducting economic analysis for the Ludwig Institute for Shared Economic Prosperity in Washington, D.C. Title of her presentation or of her thesis is Fanning the Flames, the Impact of U.S. Targeted Sanctions on Foreign Military Activity. So over to you, Nathalie.
Awesome, thank you. On January 11th, 2021, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced that the U.S. planned to designate Yemen's Houthi rebel group Ansar Allah as a foreign terrorist organization, or FTO. Ansar Allah is an armed group engaged in a brutal civil war with Yemen's Saudi-backed government. Throughout the war, Ansar Allah has adopted extreme forms of insurgency. The group has tortured prisoners, used sexual violence as a means of control, and employed child soldiers. Despite the group's brutal reputation, the decision to sanction Ansar Allah was not met with applause. American foreign policymakers argued that the benefits from sanctioning the group, certain financial and travel restrictions, paled in comparison to the drawbacks, as labeling the war's winning side as an international terrorist group was unlikely to spark cooperation. Others regarded the designation as long overdue. Elliott Abrams, the former Deputy National Security Advisor to George W. Bush, expressed that, quote, "The Houthis have long committed and continue to commit acts of terror. They should be designated as a foreign terrorist organization because they are a foreign terrorist organization," end quote. What explains this controversy regarding the use of targeted sanctions to punish militant groups? And how do sanctions impact the behavior of these groups? My thesis will address these questions. My thesis asks the questions, how do targeted sanctions impact the behavior and strategy of non-state actors? To answer this question, I compiled an original data set of all US and UN targeted sanctions against militant groups from 1990 to 2018. I conduct a large N analysis to understand the relationship between sanction imposition and militant group behavior. I employ a game theory focused case study to better understand the causality of these statistical findings. My thesis finds that unilateral US sanctions actually lead to rises in group violence. American sanctions severely impact a group's legitimacy, but do not impact a group's financial resources. Stripping groups of international legitimacy through American sanctions reduces the incentives for non-state actors to constrain forms of violence employed by their militants. My presentation will proceed as follows. I will first provide a brief background on the history of targeted sanctions. I will discuss conventional logic on the purpose of targeted sanctions, followed by a presentation of my hypotheses. I will discuss the methods and results from my large N analysis and present a case study on the militant group Hizbul Mujahideen, and end with a discussion of research and policy contributions. It is important to define and clarify what sanctions are before continuing. Sanctions are economic instruments used to pursue a wide variety of foreign policy goals. States employ many types of sanctions, such as trade restrictions, asset freezes, arms embargoes, and more. Targeted sanctions, which is what this thesis examines, are just sanctions applied towards an individual, group, or business rather than a nation as a whole. The use of targeted sanctions is actually a rather new foreign policy instrument that gained popularity in the 1990s. Two phenomena contributed to this trend. After the first Gulf War, humanitarians heavily criticized the UN for the total trade embargo imposed by the UN Security Council against Iraq. Despite the UN attempting to punish Saddam Hussein for his actions, the sanctions caused tens of thousands of deaths in Iraq from starvation. Policymakers hope to reimagine a more humane way to impose sanctions. Second, the rising threat of terrorist groups in the late 1990s forced the US and UN to develop new methods of specifically targeting non-state actors. In 1997, the US adopted a list known as the Foreign Terrorist Organizations List, or FTO list. Militant groups added to this list experience a myriad of economic and diplomatic sanctions and are also internationally shamed as a terrorist organization. Between 1999 to 2001, the UN adopted a similar sanctions list in response to the growing threat of Al-Qaeda. Over the last 20 years, hundreds of groups have been sanctioned by these lists. What does current research say on the use of targeted sanctions to punish militant groups? First, a popular adaptation of the bargaining model notes that targeted sanctions change a militant group's expected probability of success in a conflict, as sanctions both limit a militant group's access to resources and signal the international community's resolve to fight against the group. Sanctioning a group may make it more likely to bargain rather than continue with insurgency. Other recent scholarship says that targeted sanctions should only limit the capabilities of groups with vulnerable resources. Groups with funding sources that cannot easily be targeted by traditional economic sanctions, such as groups that rely on petty crime and robbery to fund their campaigns, will face few consequences from the imposition of economic sanctions against them. These theories motivated my hypotheses. I test 3 sets of hypotheses in my large N analysis. Inspired by the bargaining model, the first hypothesis states that applying targeted sanctions against a group should lead to a decrease in violence and activity committed by the group, as the weakened position of the group should make it more likely to bargain. The second hypothesis states that UN multilateral sanctions should be more effective than US unilateral sanctions in limiting group activity. While US sanctions only require US governments and businesses to abide by them, UN sanctions require hundreds of nations around the world to simultaneously sanction and punish a group. Last, sanctions should be ineffective against groups with low resource vulnerability, or resources that cannot easily be targeted by formal financial institutions. I hypothesize that 3 types of funding sources, petty criminal activity, state, and non-state sponsorship, should make groups particularly invulnerable to sanction imposition, while 2 types of funding sources, reliance on natural resource exports and reliance on legitimate businesses, should make groups very vulnerable to sanction imposition. To conduct my large N analysis, I compiled an original group year panel dataset. I collected data on my dependent variable, group kills and attacks, from the Global Terrorism Database. I merged this data with an original dataset I compiled on US and UN sanctions. Finally, I added several group and country-level variables to my dataset, such as information on which form of resources groups relied on, group religion, ideology, etc. All of this data combined to form a complete group year panel dataset with information on every group's activity and sanctioning status from 1990 to 2018. My dataset consisted of a total of 636 groups, 165 of which have experienced sanctions by either the US, UN, or both, and 471 of which have never been formally designated or sanctioned by either. The difficulty in any quantitative study of sanctions is that groups are not sanctioned randomly. Let me repeat myself. Groups are not sanctioned randomly. Sanctioned groups differ from non-sanctioned groups in a myriad of ways, and no quantitative study will ever be able to perfectly control for this bias. Still, there are several methods we can employ to help reduce the bias. First, I employed a fixed effects regression model. For those unfamiliar with regression, this just allowed me to control for group and country level characteristics like religion, ideology, goal, location, etc. Second, I employed a few specific control variables that may be correlated with both my independent variable, sanction imposition, and my dependent variable, group activity. And finally, I employed a series of 3 robustness tests to ensure any statistical result I got was rigorous. For example, one robustness test reruns my regressions, but drops extreme outlier groups like Boko Haram and the Islamic State, whose high level of activity may have disproportionately impacted my findings. Now, onto the results. First, the data shows that my first hypothesis was incorrect. Sanction imposition is actually correlated with a significant increase in kills committed by groups. The result was confirmed by all 3 robustness tests and goes against the conventional bargaining theory of sanctions. Yet my second hypothesis shows that this trend is not universal. My second result found that only US sanctions applied without multilateral support lead to spikes in violence committed by groups. In contrast, UN sanctions precipitate falls in militant group activity. This result suggests that sanctions are much more effective in limiting group behavior when implemented with multilateral support. And my last result found that sanction effectiveness is not heavily dependent upon resource vulnerability. With these results, let's pause and go back to my original research question, which asked, how do targeted sanctions impact behavior and strategy of non-state actors? Our larger analysis illustrates that while UN sanctions limit the activity of groups, unilateral US sanctions lead to rises in violence committed by non-state actors. The final section of my thesis attempts to understand exactly why groups commit greater levels of violence after being sanctioned by the US. To better understand why non-state actors commit more violence after US sanctions, I develop a model mapping the incentives of militant groups. The simple model relies on 2 assumptions. First, insurgent groups value international legitimacy. Militant groups may refrain from employing certain extreme types of violence to retain international legitimacy. This legitimacy may increase external donations to the group, provoke sympathy and support from foreign states, and most importantly, assist groups in gaining international recognition if they succeed in setting up a new government. Second, insurgent groups can also often strategically benefit from employing more extreme forms of violence. For example, groups can put greater pressure on governments to negotiate by targeting civilians. They can increase manpower and recruits by using child soldiers, and they can have access to huge sums of money and resources by partnering with groups like Al-Qaeda. While these forms of insurgency may lose a group international legitimacy, they can also help them strategically, especially in the short run. With these assumptions, let's move on to the model. First, let's assume that at any time t, a group decides which form of violence and insurgency to employ. Consider types of violence on a scale, where v equals 1 represents forms of insurgency in opposition to international norms, such as using suicide bombs or partnering with the Islamic State. And v equals 0 represents violence more respectful of international norms, like solely targeting opposing military forces. Of course, violence does not actually exist on a one-dimensional scale like this, but this scale is helpful for the purposes of the model. Now, consider the payoffs between a militant group choosing which form of violence and insurgency to employ. Let P represent the baseline probability of a militant group succeeding in a conflict against the state, and V and I are variables altering this probability. As previously described, if a militant group chooses to employ a more extreme form of violence, they may gain several types of strategic advantages in the conflict, represented by the variable V. Yet employing extreme violence also loses the group some international legitimacy. They may lose international support and donations, and foreign governments may be more willing to assist the domestic government in any counterinsurgency effort against them. This loss of legitimacy is represented by the variable I. As you may realize, a militant group will restrain itself and abide by international norms if the advantage it accrues from retaining international legitimacy is greater than the strategic advantage it gains from employing extreme violence. Finally, consider what happens in this game when a militant group is designated as an FTO. An FTO designation strips a group of international legitimacy, as addition to a US sanctions list is a death sentence to a group's international reputation. This reality is reflected in the change payoffs, pointed to by the red arrow. After a group is sanctioned by the US, it lacks international legitimacy no matter which type of violence it employs. As a result, this previous incentive for the group to restrain the types of violence and insurgency it employs is gone. After being sanctioned by the US, we should see groups adopt more heightened and extreme forms of violence, as the group is no longer incentivized by international acceptance and recognition to restrain itself. This equilibrium is highlighted in yellow. To give life to this model, I present a very brief case study on the militant group Hizbul Mujahideen, or HM, which is an Islamist militant group operating in Indian-administered Kashmir that seeks to reunite the region with Pakistan. In this case study, I show that US sanctions remove the incentive for HM to restrict and limit the type of violence it employed. Throughout the 1990s, HM was by far the most powerful group operating in Kashmir. Although HM was considered the greatest militant threat to Indian security in the 1990s and early 2000s, the group has always sought to differentiate itself from other militant groups in the region. From its inception until quite recently, the group has never relied on support from the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, or other violent Islamist groups in the region to fund its campaign. Compared to other groups in the region, HM has also explicitly attempted to primarily target Indian military forces and limit the violence its militants commits against civilians. HM has historically gone to great lengths to publicize this narrative of its organization as a homegrown insurgent group rather than an international terrorist organization. At least on the international stage, HM's strategy has historically paid off. Directly after the creation of the US FTO list, several other Kashmiri militant groups were designated and sanctioned as foreign terrorist organizations by the United States. By staying off this list for years, HM kept its reputation as an insurgent group fighting for sovereignty. This is critical to the group's survival, as much of its finances depend on donations from abroad and support from foreign states. Yet in 2017, the Trump administration finally designated and sanctioned HM as a foreign terrorist organization. As the model would predict, HM's level of violence spiked. It began killing more police forces, Indian military members, and civilians than it had in the past 20 years. More fascinating than the spike in violence, though, is the change in HM's strategic partnerships. As just discussed, HM historically avoided partnering with more extreme groups to retain its international reputation as a homegrown insurgent group. After the FTO designation, this restraint begins to deteriorate. Evidence exists showing that HM collaborated with militants from Al-Qaeda, other more violent Kashmiri groups, and even the Islamic State over the past several years. Clearly, the incentives of HM to distance itself from these more extreme groups has vanished after being sanctioned and designated by the US. Finally, it is also important to note that this model cannot and should not explain every transformation in HM's behavior. Other factors surely contributed to the group's changing status and strategy. For example, a popular HM commander was killed in 2016, sparking outcry from HM supporters, which surely contributed to some of this new violence. Second, this model may not be applicable to every insurgent group. Who's to say I didn't just cherry pick HM and create a model not representative of most groups? However, to further check the validity of the model in general, I ran one final test with my group year panel dataset and showed that even when controlled for conflict intensity, violence against civilians significantly rises after the imposition of unilateral US sanctions without multilateral support, with this result highlighted in red. Compared to a control group, we see that US sanctions are associated with an average increase in 118 civilian deaths committed by the groups each year. While this number is arbitrary itself, the most important thing to realize is that groups target and kill more civilians after they receive US sanctions without multilateral support. To conclude, my thesis is added to the literature on sanctions by producing a new comprehensive group year data set on every US and UN targeted sanction from 1990 to 2018. The statistical results of this data set challenge the bargaining model of sanctions. While UN sanctions, as expected, correlate with declines in group activity, US sanctions applied without multilateral support cause significant spikes in violence committed by groups. By developing a simple model, this thesis shows that some of this violence may originate from the reduced incentives of militant groups to abide by international norms, bargain, and constrain the types of violence employed by their militants. In terms of policy contributions, my thesis suggests that obtaining multilateral support for sanctions is critical in ensuring a sanction regime actually limits the operating capabilities of non-state actors. In addition, while my thesis certainly illustrates the unintentional consequences of US sanction application, my model suggests that these consequences may be less relevant for groups that already show a complete disregard for bargaining and international norms in conflict. It is most important to critically examine the application of US unilateral sanctions against groups that value bargaining, international legitimacy, and exhibit some restraint in their insurgency. Lastly, I would like to thank everyone who has supported me throughout this process. To Professor Weinstein, I honestly could not have imagined having a more supportive and invested thesis advisor, and getting to talk with you this past year has really been one of the academic highlights of my Stanford experience. To the CISAC teaching team, your generosity this year has not gone unnoticed, and we so much appreciate you guys spending so much of your time and energy into creating an incredible year despite the restraints of COVID. And to all my friends and family and fellow cohort members, thank you for putting up with me this past year and hearing all of my worries about my thesis. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Right, Natalie, thank you very much for your fine presentation. We have 10 minutes for questions. We'll first turn to your advisor, then to members of the class and teaching team. And as time allows, then we'll take questions from the outer room, people who are on the webinar. And for that group, I would ask them to submit their questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of their screen, and then I'll read the questions to Natalie. Professor Weinstein.
Great, thanks so much, Rod, and congratulations, Natalie, on a terrific presentation and an excellent thesis. We were joking at the outset that we should be giving you a master's degree or a PhD for the incredible work that you have completed this year. And I see other colleagues from political science, Barry and Ken, who I also know made really valuable contributions in helping you develop this project. There are two questions that I wanted to ask, and they relate to this really critical policy implication that you're drawing about multilateralism versus unilateralism in the sanction space. And so the first question is, how do you interpret the effect of multilateral sanctions versus unilateral sanctions? That is the effect that you're seeing something about the power of multilateral action through the sanctions mechanism? Or do you think it's possible that multilateral sanctions are a proxy for other things that are happening as a result of international consensus around that conflict that might lessen the risk of violence or bring violence to an end? And the second question, which is sort of on the same front, which is, this work that you've done with the HM case and the Kashmiri region really focuses our attention on the incentives of groups to use violence or not, and in particular to use violence against civilians. But nothing in your model tells us why we would think there would be a different relationship between the imposition of US sanctions and multilateral sanctions on the use of violence against civilians. And so I wonder if you could shed light on why you think that relationship, in particular, given that the loss of legitimacy that would come from US sanctions or multilateral sanctions is similar, why we don't see the same effects on the use of violence.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that question. And I feel like I can actually probably answer both questions with the same response. So I didn't have time to go over it in my presentation because of the restraints, but basically the difference in how a UN or multilateral sanction would affect a group compared to a US sanction, for me, in the original model I developed, if you think about it, I didn't add a cost like variable C associated with the economic or diplomatic restraints imposed on the group. I only added a legitimacy cost I. And I added that because a lot of the research I had done, specifically understanding the actual costs that US sanctions impose on groups, didn't show that they actually were able to target that many resources, like American sanctions specifically. So when I was kind of pouring through the US Treasury data, a lot of some groups like Al-Qaeda, you would see that they would freeze hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. But the majority of groups, it's a little sad. They only freeze $100, or some of them were even like $50 to $4 frozen each year. So for me, it came to the conclusion that the majority of the groups, the cost of putting a US sanction without multilateral support is only really symbolic and legitimacy and not an actual cost associated with their resources. The way I would change the model is by actually adding a variable C, which represents the cost that is associated with multilateral sanctions. With unilateral sanctions, only US financial institutions and businesses have to freeze the assets of groups. But I don't really expect, most militant groups in Kashmir to be using US financial institutions. So why would that actually make an impact? But I really do believe that unilateral or multilateral sanctions have a much larger effect because basically every single country around the world is basically enforced to freeze these sanctions, restrict the travel of groups, restrict donations to the groups from nonprofit, restrict the travel of insurgents coming in and out of borders. All of these things that if the UN finds that the government is explicitly allowing these groups to continue to do despite being sanctioned, they can then be punished by the UN. So basically, if I were to change that model, I would agree that the legitimacy of these groups may still decrease, and the incentive for them to commit more types of extreme violence may increase after being sanctioned by the UN. But the difference is that they actually have their resources and travel ability restricted by UN sanctions. And so there's a cost associated with that, whereas there isn't really an actual cost associated with US sanctions. So that's kind of how I would answer both questions, is that for me, I actually do believe it is the kind of economic and travel restrictions by UN sanctions. But I do understand what you're kind of saying with the first question about different proxies, like maybe UN sanctions just signal that the international community is about to support a counterinsurgency effort or something like that. I did try to control for those variables with my control variables. I tried to control for changes in country instability and political violence, and also changes in military aid given to the country. So those are things I attempted to control, and if I controlled them correctly, it should have been okay. But anyway, that's my long answer to your question.
Great. Professor Weinstein, any other questions?
Nope, we can open it up to the group.
All right. To the people that I can see, just raise your hands. Okay, Dylan.
Awesome. Fantastic presentation, Nathalie. So thanks again for sharing your research with us. One question I had in hearing the differences between multilateral and unilateral sanctions is, I know that it is difficult to rally support to multilateral sanctions of certain groups. So are there situations that you think it's advisable or even a good option for US policymakers to unilaterally sanction a group? When is that a mechanism that you believe it should be used?
Yeah, I didn't also have time to go into this in the presentation, but UN sanctions are much more difficult to apply than US sanctions. US sanctions basically only require a group to be considered a threat to the United States, which can really be anything. But UN sanctions, you basically have to be associated with a few specific groups. So you have to be associated with Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or the Islamic State. So it's a lot harder to apply US or UN or multilateral sanctions against different types of groups, which is a really big problem and something that I hope will eventually change. But yeah, your question is like, what's a good example of when the US should apply unilateral sanctions? One specific case that comes to mind, which I actually was reading about almost a year ago now, is when the US decided to sanction the real IRA in 2001, which is a very niche case. But why this was really interesting to me is that the real IRA was basically the only Irish dissident group, Republican group, that had rejected the Good Friday Agreement. And so at that point, it was signaling that it wasn't willing to bargain with the UK or the international community at all, In addition, what's really interesting about the Irish case is that, like I just said, while most militant groups, their funding sources and assets aren't really related to US individuals and donations, what's really interesting about the Irish case is that US individuals and nonprofits were actually one of the greatest supporters of that conflict, just because of the large Irish population in the US. And so, sanctioning that and preventing US individuals and nonprofits and companies from supporting that group would actually maybe have an effect compared to any other conflict in the world. So I do think there are instances where unilateral sanctions could be appropriate, especially if right now it's impossible to sanction with the UN. But they are, I think you have to like think a lot about them. But that's kind of one example that I think would be a good use of a unilateral sanction.
Other questions from the class? All right, we have a number of questions in the queue here. Let me read one which is actually related to what was just being discussed. This is from Avery Rogers. What are the factors that would cause a group to be put on the US FTO list, but not sanctioned by the UN? Is there some common trait among groups that only get to the unilateral sanctions imposed and might have an impact on your results? You've answered this in part, but the second part of the question expand.
Yeah, that's a great question and something that I definitely struggled and talked with Professor Weinstein in my research design as well. But there is a big difference, which is basically groups that are, the majority of groups that are sanctioned by the UN are Islamist groups, and that they're associated with the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda in some sort. This doesn't mean they have to be, direct proxies of them or they have to receive financial support. There have been cases where a group has just pledged support online and they've been sanctioned. But there is a difference in that the US sanctions a much greater variety of groups. Obviously, it sanctions groups in Ireland as well as Pakistan. But the UN list tends to explicitly sanction these other types of groups that are associated with Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. So I did have to think about how to control for those differences in my analysis to make sure that there wasn't a large bias there. I employed a few variables to do that. The first was obviously I controlled for religion and ideology, but I think the most important control I put was actually group resources and funding sources. So I employed a control that was basically whether a group was primarily supported by other non-state actors or not. And when you look at groups that are sanctioned by the UN, the vast majority of them are primarily supported by either Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State. So I did have to think about how to kind of control for that bias, and those are the two main controls I use to do that. But it is an important thing to note, and I do in my thesis that might be a bias that I didn't intend that may have affected the results in some way.
Right, thank you. We're at the end of our time. This has been a fascinating presentation, and I'm sorry we don't have more time for discussion, but we want to thank Nathalie for a really excellent presentation. And we will take a short break. Please return by 3:15, and we'll hear from our next student speaker, Dylan Junkin. Okay, thank you very much. Welcome back to for the second presentation by one of our honor students, in this case, Dylan Junkin. Dylan is a senior studying international relations and human rights. After researching disinformation for the Department of Defense and working for a journalism tech startup, Dylan chose to investigate Chinese state media partnerships in East Asia and the Pacific. After graduation, he will move to DC and work as a junior fellow at the Stimson Center.
Thank you for the introduction, Dr. Yoon. In July 2019, Thailand's Matichan Group, one of the nation's major news conglomerates, signed a partnership agreement with Xinhua News Agency, China's largest state media group. This agreement allowed the Matichan Group to republish Xinhua content free of charge. By the end of the year, 11 additional Thai news agencies would follow Matichan's lead, forming partnerships with Xinhua and publishing pro-CCP content directly from Beijing. Outside observers describe the transformation of Thailand's media environment as unprecedented and a sign of growing Chinese influence in the region. However, closer investigation reveals these partnerships are not as novel as they seem. Forming partnerships with local media groups is one tactic that Chinese state media frequently employ to gain influence in this region, publishing content in local, trusted outlets. My thesis asks, How do Chinese state media partnerships impact perceptions of China and East Asia and the Pacific? In investigating this topic, I addressed two separate questions in my research. First, I sought to understand why some partnerships are better at shaping perceptions of China than others. And second, I explored how the content of partner groups reflected these differences in effectiveness. I answered this question through mixed methodology, using an original medium and dataset, an interview with a Xinhua journalist, and case studies of partner content during the COVID-19 pandemic. The results of my thesis contradict the conventional logic that partnerships with larger multilingual media would have greater impact on perceptions of China and East Asia and the Pacific, as measured by public opinion polls. Interestingly, the small Chinese language media groups were the most effective. Media groups had different amounts of agency depending on their relations with Chinese state media and their size. Additionally, large media groups featured counter-narratives that appeared to mute the effect of PRC propaganda. These findings suggest that small Chinese language platforms are uniquely vulnerable to influence from foreign media. Policymakers should support independent publishers to prevent the consolidation of the Chinese language media ecosystem and provide media groups access to affordable, diverse content. Recently, one second. Although Chinese state media partnerships have received attention from journalists and researchers at think tanks, academia is only beginning to contribute to this literature. First, I'm going to give a brief overview of the progression of my research. So I'm going to discuss the literature review, a data set and regression, my interview I did with a Xinhua journalist, and the case study. And then last, I'll discuss implications of my research. So as I briefly stated before, research is mainly from journalists and academic and think tanks at this point, but contributions from academia is rather limited. Recently, scholars at the University of London Mary examined China's content sharing partnerships in East Asia and the Pacific. Their report analyzed the relationship between partnerships and perceptions of China, concluding that partnerships are correlated with increasing approval and decreasing disapproval of China. They claim that content sharing partnerships are the most significant form of method of public diplomacy used by China. However, these results are losing relevance and warrant reinvestigation. In the last 3 years, there's been a massive shift in both the number of partnerships and perceptions of China throughout the region. Additionally, this previous research treated every partnership as equal, which does not capture the nuance of partnerships, since some occur with small Chinese language media groups and others with the largest news organizations in the region. My investigation fills this gap in the literature by investigating why certain partnerships are more influential than others, providing insight on the actual mechanisms by which partnerships shift perceptions. My original dataset identifies 98 partnerships between Chinese state media and foreign media in 12 East Asian and Pacific countries across 15 years from 2006 to 2020. Thailand was an outlier in this group, by far having the most partnerships. However, all countries featured at least one partnership, and most featured between 5 and 10. As a starting point for my research, I examined an older dataset created by Emily Fang, a reporter at the Financial Times. I searched these media groups on Baidu and Google in both Chinese and English, using advanced features to search for mentions of these articles alongside mentions of PRC state media. I utilized the Google plugin to automatically translate non-English text and conduct further analysis. I also researched attendees of specific PRC-led cooperation events, such as the Global Chinese Language Media Forum, and found groups from scholarly articles about media influence. I specifically sought to investigate partnerships with non-Chinese language media that were absent from earlier research. In compiling this dataset, I coded for additional variables to describe the nuances of each partnership. I used binary indicators to list if a media group was Chinese language or non-Chinese language, and whether or not it had a presence on Chinese or Western social media. I also included the metric of readership, using CrowdTangle to record the number of website page shares, recording information on print circulation, and investigating groups' followings on social media. Using this research, I coded media groups into 3 categories: small, medium, and large, to investigate how group size impacted their effectiveness in shaping perceptions of China. I also grouped partnerships into 3 categories to describe the strength of their relationship with China: weak, moderate, and strong. The plurality of partnerships occurred with small media groups. However, in the past 3 years, the number of partnerships with medium and large groups has grown substantially. I also found the majority of partnerships to be relatively weak. However, because of the often secret nature of cooperation with the PRC, many groups did not meet my requirements to declare a tie to be moderate or strong. so this category likely underestimates the strength of groups' cooperations with China. Additionally, more than half of partnerships occurred with groups that publish content in a non-Chinese language. Using a panel analysis regression with fixed effects, I first reestablished that there was a relationship between partnerships and perceptions of China. Running tests using count of partnerships per country year as my independent variable and approval of China as my dependent variable. I then tested this again with disapproval of China as my dependent variable. Data on the public opinion of China came from the Gallup World Polls annual survey. I concluded that each new partnership was correlated with both increasing approval of China and decreasing disapproval, although this relationship was only significant for disapproval. Because I found disapproval to have a more significant relationship, I tested my 3 hypotheses using this dependent variable. First, I supposed that larger media groups would be more effective at changing perceptions of China. Second, I hypothesized that groups with stronger ties would be more effective. And third, I expected groups that published non-Chinese language content to be more effective. My results contradicted the first hypothesis. Small and medium partnerships were associated with an overall reduction in disapproval of 2%. Conversely, large partnerships were actually found to, on average, increase disapproval of China by a small amount. The results of the second hypothesis remain unclear. Weak, moderate, and strong partnerships all produced a decrease in disapproval, but only weak partnerships had a significant relationship. The third hypothesis was not supported by these results. Non-Chinese language media were found to be less impactful than Chinese language media. These surprising results are likely due to the process of partnership formation and the nature of relationships between PRC state media and their overseas partners, a dynamic that I investigated during my interview with the Xinhua reporter. On a secure line monitored by a US government official, I spoke to an individual who was one of the only non-Chinese citizens working at an overseas bureau of Xinhua News. He does not work for Xinhua because of any ideological affinity, but got the job out of necessity after a change in government left him unemployed from his job at a state news agency. The reporter confirmed in a simple yet profound statement, what Xinhua wants is more partnerships with local media. They want it to look organic, appearing unattributed in local media. That would be ideal. Other news services like the Associated Press and AFP charge for their news, but Xinhua offers their content for free. This presents an attractive alternative to expensive Western outlets. The journalist I spoke to explained that under-resourced media in Southeast Asia use Xinhua content out of necessity, rather than choice or ideological affiliation. Additionally, Xinhua sometimes offers bribes to editors, providing additional incentive to accept pro-CCP content. Xinhua's partnerships with these vulnerable papers, most of whom were coded as small or medium in my dataset, offer the most opportunity for direct influence and reprinting of pro-CCP material, which likely accounts for their ability to shift perceptions of China. Conversely, the journalist explained that larger, more well-resourced publications purchase content and have more mutually beneficial relations, allowing them more agency in deciding what to print. Larger groups less easily become vessels of influence for Chinese media. I further explored these surprising results using a case study of media partner content during the COVID-19 pandemic. I hypothesized that small Chinese language media groups would publish more CCP influenced content than large multilingual media groups. I then broke this hypothesis down into 3 sub-hypotheses. First, small Chinese language media groups will feature more pro-CCP narratives than large multilingual groups. Second, small Chinese language media groups will publish more direct content than large multilingual groups. And third, large multilingual groups will feature more counter-narratives than small Chinese language groups. Using a subset of the 56 partnerships from the original dataset, I explored the prevalence of 4 distinct narratives that originated in China's state media's portrayal of the COVID-19 pandemic. Wuhan lockdown, mass diplomacy, economic miracle, and vaccine diplomacy are the 4 names I gave to them. These narratives were prevalent in Chinese state media at different stages of the pandemic. I also tracked the prevalence of direct content use, which I defined as an explicit reference to Chinese state media as the source of an image, text, or video. I also as well tracked the prevalence of counter-narratives, which I defined as anti-PRC and anti-CCP narratives about COVID-19. The first 2 hypotheses were not supported. I found that media groups carried pro-CCP narratives and used direct content at similar rates, regardless of their size and language. However, the prevalence of counter-narratives in large multilingual groups was higher than small Chinese language platforms. 70% featured counter-narratives, whereas not a single small platform carried a counter-narrative. Detailed analysis of content from Malaysia's The Star and Australia's Australia Pacific Media Group reveals differences between large and small publications. Large media groups with their own staff and ability to purchase content from wire services such as AP, Reuters, AFP, and DW consistently expose readers to diverse opinions. While they also use Xinhua content, it is often only photos and videos that are used. Conversely, the Australian Chinese Daily sourced entire articles directly from China News Service and Xinhua News, and did not feature a single counter narrative. This research has massive implications for our current understanding of PRC influence operations and media influence in general. Conventional logic would show that the large multilingual groups will reach more people and thus be more significant vessels of influence when partnered with Chinese state media. My research contradicts this, showing that the most significant influence actually occurs against the most vulnerable media groups. The case study specifically reveals the importance of counter-narratives for muting the effects of foreign influence operations. There are two avenues for future scholarly research. First, scholars should study the incentive structures of media groups to analyze why organizations choose to partner with Chinese media. My research suggests that groups partner because of low resources, but ideological affiliation and business ties should also be investigated. Second, the content of partner groups could be studied through automated analysis of large volumes of data. This could reveal trends in the data beyond the scope of my project. My research has implications for policymakers as well. Policymakers should consider methods of promoting a diversity of opinions in the foreign media environments, especially in the Chinese language media space, which is becoming increasingly consolidated. A recent think tank report about Chinese language media in Australia shows that 55 of the 90 Chinese language newspapers in Australia have closed in the last decade, leaving only one paper that is truly independent of PRC influence. Consolidation and digitalization of the Chinese language media environment risks undermining media freedom and reducing the prevalence of diverse opinions. Circling back to the recent expansion of Xinhua partnerships in Thailand, these events no longer seem as worrying. The 12 large Thai news agencies were all large multilingual groups publishing content in Thai and English. They will likely use Xinhua content and advance PRC narratives, but they will also source information from international wire services like Reuters, the Associated Press, and AFP, which will promote counter-narratives. Above all, these groups can maintain agency in their relationship with Chinese state media and will not necessarily become vessels of foreign influence. In an interconnected, globalized East Asia and the Pacific, it is not appropriate nor reasonable to expect media groups not to cooperate with Chinese state media. It is inevitable that groups will need to cooperate and will need to source content from Chinese state media. Instead of promoting a monolithic view of Chinese state media and expecting groups not to advance these narratives, the US should work to maintain a diversity of viewpoints and promote counter-narratives in trusted local groups. In the age of great power competition, media resilience can be media resistance. Thank you to my advisors, Dr. Ken Schultz and Dr. Glenn Tiffert, as well as to the cohort leaders, Dr. Amy Ziegert, Dr. Rod Ewing, and Dr. Esfandiar Amir. As Nathalie summarized, it's really been a fantastic year despite all of the challenges of the pandemic. So thank you all for adapting alongside us and helping us go through this journey. And of course, thank you to my family and friends, and I'm happy to open it up to discussion now. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Dylan. So as before, we'll turn first to the advisors, then to the members of the class and the teaching team, and then finally to those who are in the outer room of the webinar. For those in the outer room, please use the question and answer function, and I'll pose your questions to Dylan when we come to that time period. So, Professor Schultz, would you like to start?
Sure, I'll be quick. Dylan, this was great, and it's been fabulous to see how this project developed, and I had not yet before seen the piece at the end about the COVID narratives, which I think was a very clever way to get at the actual content of what's going on here. So my question, the question I want to ask is, what do you think China's up to, in the sense, like, it seems like they're doubling down on the wrong strategy, if you're right, like, because they're moving more into the big partnerships. And in some ways, this asks you back to an earlier version of your project, which is, what are they doing wrong? And I'm just wondering if now that you've had a chance to really think about this, do you have any insight into what you think they're doing or what they believe they're doing, Do they see something you don't see, or do you see something they don't see?
That's a fantastic question. So I guess I like to open it up then. So I think that my initial hunch is that I think one of the first steps may be in a broader strategy by the Chinese state media, which of course received sort of their orders and their marching points from CCP leadership. I think a lot of this might go back to some initial steps were taken probably to consolidate the Chinese language media space and work directly with the overseas Chinese population, with which I believe that the CCP leadership see as a main area sort of influence and of ability to shape what happens in other countries. So I know there's the United Front Work Department, which is one sort of informal network of ties that China has that connects overseas Chinese communities and allows them to exercise influence through like business ties. And that's a way I think that there's been this consolidation like we've seen of the Chinese language media space. But I do think, and part of the reason they might be expanding more into these large partnerships now is they're trying to figure out how to make those work, I would think. And I also think that at the same time, these large partnerships probably benefit the Chinese state media as well. So one thing I wanted to learn more through my research that I haven't had as much time to do was sort of what are the benefits for these large media who choose to partner with Chinese state media. Maybe there's a reason that they're increasingly partnering with them as well. So like looking at the incentive structure, not only of Chinese state media, but also of the recipient country and the recipient partner groups, to see why is it that we're seeing this trend. So I don't necessarily think that the increasing expansion of partnerships is necessarily due to Chinese state media or Chinese leadership. It could also be due perhaps to some incentives with those large media groups. And I know China is becoming more important geopolitically throughout the region. The Belt and Road Initiative continues. Economically, China is really predominant in the region. So I think that for all those reasons, people around the region might want to know more about China, and thus there might be more pressure for these media groups domestically to have more content from China, to have more information about China and stuff. So I think that like we're probably seeing both the partner group and the partnering group have some sort of agency.
Right. Professor Schultz, other questions?
Oh, I'll defer time to others.
All right. Dr. Tiefert.
I want to echo Dylan. Thank you, by the way. I want to echo Professor Schultz's comments and compliments about how much this project has developed and how far you brought it, Dylan. It's really great work. And I want to invite you now to spin out some hypotheses and next step questions. Your thesis took a look at largely the consumer, the supplier side of this equation, and that is the small, medium, and large media outlets in Thailand and other countries. But I wonder if you have any insights drawn from your study of these media outlets, what their readerships are. One might hypothesize, for example, that a small media outlet might have potentially a more homogeneous readership that would be more susceptible to a particular kind of message, either to increase approval or disapproval. Whereas a media outlet, say like the Bangkok Post, would have a much more diverse readership and therefore might pull in different directions or react to the diverse messaging it's getting in a much more complex set of ways. Do you have any insights, and this would go towards the policy prescriptions that you have for how the readerships might vary and the best way to offset the differential impact that's having at the small, medium, and large media outlets with respect to those readerships?
That's also a really great question. And it reminds me of one thing that you and I had discussed in one of our many conversations about the idea that the Chinese language media space, although I'm referring to it as this monolithic entity in our conversations and in my presentation, is not this one thing. So for example, in many of these Southeast Asian countries, there is a community of Chinese people who have lived there for generations, who are at this point relatively aging, but then the younger generation who are their children, and also recent immigrants from China might have completely different opinions and completely different perspectives on what it means to be Chinese, what it means to speak Chinese, read Chinese, what media they want to interact with in Chinese. So I think there's some interesting sort of analysis to be done there about who's reading these older groups. And I know one thing I've read sort of that came up repeatedly in my research was that the print circulation of many of these groups is declining because they're the people who used to read them are now aging or passing away or older. So I think we're seeing a big transition to digital media, which in some ways I think is also accelerating this sort of consolidation of the Chinese language media space. So initially there might have been lots of independent media groups and readership might have been varied and people might have been exposed to different stuff. But now if all you speak and all you read is Chinese language, I think that you might be exposed to less counter narratives and less other information than you would have before. So I think readership of these print circulations is declining, but then readership of these online groups, online Chinese language groups is actually increasing recently because there's more immigrants from these different, from China to the Southeast Asian countries. So I think, for example, in like in Weibo and WeChat, there's a lot of, you see an interesting trend also, which I haven't really discussed too much in my research, but many of these media groups are actually cutting their print circulation and then creating Chinese language social media spaces in which they share this information again. So like, I think the readership is going through a transition in that way, which is accelerating like sort of the monolithization of Chinese media into this one sort of narrative. I hope that gets through your question, but I'm also happy to expand upon it more.
Great. I want to open it up now.
All right. To the class or teaching team, questions, just raise your hand. Nathalie?
Yeah, I feel like one of the cool ways your research differentiates itself from other research is that you don't treat each, obviously, media group and media partnership the exact same, which previous research has done. But I was interested, if you go back to like slide, I think it was 13 in your notes, I was interested in like how you decided that these three characteristics, I think it's like language, size, and partnerships, that was going to be the most influential thing guiding your research, and not other characteristics, because there are so many different characteristics of media groups.
So this also brings me to a sort of an anecdote from my research process. So at some point in the research, I came across a really great article that I mentioned from the University of William & Mary's Data Lab, which was really fantastic work. But as I was reading about it and I was noticing their conclusion that media partnerships were the most significant, the most influential form of PRC influence, I was a little bit saddened to find that they didn't mention the name of a single one of these media partners. So I noticed that simultaneously they said there was an extremely important, extremely critical part of China's influence operations, but then they didn't really explain what these media groups were, who were they, what countries were they partnered in. So they really gave a high level overview, but they didn't really dig into it. So I actually spoke to somebody from that research lab who gave me a little bit more information over the phone, but unfortunately was unable to share their data set with me, which prompted me on a very long, arduous journey of collecting my own data set in Chinese language, which involved lots of Google translation and was overall, though, a really beneficial process because it started exposing me to who these groups actually are, what content they're publishing. And the reason I chose size sort of ties to China and then Chinese language versus non-Chinese language was because as I was going about looking for these groups, they started to just sort themselves almost into several different camps. So almost right off the bat, it was apparent that there was a huge cluster of media groups that previous researchers had looked at who were these really small Chinese language groups. But then at the same time, I also noticed that recently there was more partnership with larger groups who were publishing in non-Chinese languages. So initially it sort of split itself into two halves, but I wanted to have a medium and a moderate opportunity also for groups that didn't quite fit into either category. And then language was a huge differentiating factor. So yeah, it became very obvious after looking at a lot of these partnerships over time.
Right, other questions from the class, teaching team? Any questions at all? All right, we have a question in the question and answer section, so let me just read it for you, Dylan. From Chase Small, are there tactics the Chinese government uses to seed propaganda through the local media groups that we should consider in order to identify Chinese state actions or social media platforms?
Hi, Chase. So I guess you're listening, but you can't respond. But I think that's a really wonderful question and gets to a lot of the research that I had done as well. Initially, when I came into this whole project, I was hoping to focus more on social media, but over time, I decided to pivot away from that just because of the difficulties of doing research on social media. And also at the same time, I started to have this hunch almost that maybe it wasn't as important as all of the sort of news articles we've been hearing about, and like the think tank reports have been talking about wolf warrior diplomats on Twitter and those sort of things. And I started developing this hunch that maybe there was something more beyond that. And that's why I came to the point of looking more at partnerships, which are a more institutional, more organizational focus about the media groups themselves, rather than just the content they're publishing on social media. But interestingly, when you do bring up social media, most of these groups do have a presence on Western social media, and they do publish lots of the content there. They do often publish content directly from Xinhua. They'll retweet Xinhua, they'll retweet CNS and CGTN and many other Chinese state media platforms. So you can look at metrics like that. Because Xinhua acts as a wire service, the groups who use that wire service often literally just copy and paste the content. So it's easy to find in that way. But what I kind of looked at with my COVID-19 pandemic case study was a little bit more broad than that. I was looking at sort of distilling the topics discussed in these Chinese state media narratives, and then looking for just similar trends in terms of what these media partners were saying. So I think that that doing that, so for example, looking for positive articles, positive sentiment around China's donation of vaccines is one easy example. So just sort of maybe alignment between like the sentiment of a post sort of, and then the topic they're talking about. And what I found set apart the groups that were more influenced by China than the groups that were less influenced was the lack of counter narratives or counter opinions against that. So I think that the thing I would look at if I were somebody looking to do research on this on social media was to see if groups were consistently over time only posting things that were pro-China. And at that point, it would seem that they were more influenced, perhaps.
Asfandiar, did you want to make a comment? Your name popped up behind the question here. No? Okay. Professor Ziegart.
Yeah, this is a great presentation. Congratulations to you, Dylan, and to Natalie. You guys did a great job in the first round of our presentation. So you got the short straw and did a terrific job. So your last answer, Dylan, prompts a new question, which is I'd love for your thoughts, initial thoughts about the relationship between these media partnerships and social media. And specifically, do you think that these partnerships in foreign countries are a leading indicator of what China's up to, or a lagging indicator of their sort of information message? So I could imagine that China wants to spread certain narratives, and they first go to their partnerships in countries in the region, and then they see what's working or what's not, and then they go to social media. I could also imagine it works the opposite way, that they try things on social media first, see what the reaction is, and then use that for their partnerships in foreign countries. So there's a sequencing issue there, and then there's a duration issue, right? So do you think that when China has messaging through these media partnerships, the real benefit is because they're more long lasting, so they can sort of keep going with the same message, whereas social media is more ephemeral? Or is that not something that you think is in play?
Those are all really, really awesome questions. I guess get to some of the questions I've been having as I've been conducting my last case study research, because this is all really coming to a head right now during the pandemic. So I think all these questions become much more pertinent when we're actually having this huge global crisis of which China plays a huge role in. So I think that, interestingly, I think this gets to one sort of feeling I've been having a lot, in that I think when people read about Chinese influence operations in the media, it tends to be this very monolithic, very top-down sort of portrayal of what's actually happening. And I don't necessarily know if that's always true. And I've tried to get at it, and it's hard to do. But I imagine that there's just a lot happening all the time. So these media groups have their own incentive structures, and then their partner groups have these own incentive structures. And then, so I think it's difficult to necessarily say that it's always this top-down thing. But I think that's the way that Xinhua and that CCP would like it to be sometimes. I think they desire more control over the partners. I think the partnerships are a way to institutionalize the use of content from these wire services. In speaking with the Xinhua journalist who I interviewed, he mentioned that in the country he's from, there were a number of groups that were using Xinhua content without even having a formal partnership. And he gave me some of their names, and I found it online, in fact, but they didn't actually have a partnership. And they wouldn't even tell Xinhua, but he said they didn't stop them because they wanted them to use this content. So I think in some ways, perhaps the partnerships might be a lagging indicator of when groups are starting to begin using Xinhua content or begin using Chinese state media content. In other ways, I think that might be a leading indicator of sort of an effort on behalf of maybe Chinese leadership. So for example, the recent push towards more large multilingual platforms, that might be sort of a leading indicator of maybe in the future they're desiring to have more of an impact outside of just the traditional Chinese language media space. So I think my answer, and it's not a really satisfying one, is that there's a lot of things happening at once, but at some points it might be lagging, at some points it might be leading.
All right. This brings us to the end of this session. So let's thank both speakers for such an excellent job. And before releasing the crowd, I'll invite you to the same place, same time next week for the next two honor students presentations. I don't have the names in front of me, but they're on the CISAC website. So my thanks to all who have attended and those who have asked questions. And now at least two students can relax a little bit. Okay, thank you very much.